Welcome to Sparks of Justice. I'm your host, Leslie Mills. This podcast was created to lift up the stories of local activists to inspire you to get involved in your own communities. It can be difficult to keep our hearts open to all the injustices that are impacting society these days. In an increasingly complicated world, we want to connect to the good work that's already being done, because it's only by coming together that we can build a movement. We have Lena Gardner joining us for today's episode, and I am so excited for you to hear what she has to say. Lena is a passionate and lifelong advocate for justice, and I don't think it's possible to listen to her without catching some of her fire to take back into your own life. Lena is the executive director and co-founder of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, also known as BLUE. She has her Master of Arts in Justice and Peace Studies from United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, but her main and most important job is as a solo mom by choice to her preschooler. They live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Lena was active in the movement for Black Lives between 2013 and 2016 as a central leader of the Black Lives Matter Minneapolis chapter, and in her Unitarian Universalist faith locally and nationally since 2012. So, Lena, it is a joy to have you here on Sparks of Justice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we could start by having you talk a little bit about what your relationship is to Unitarian Universalism here in Minnesota.
Yeah, I found UUism at a time in my life where I was really searching for and needing community and love. It was 9 months or so after my dad had passed away, and this was all many years ago now. This was in 2009. And so when I first found it, I was in the middle of really deep grief and sort of not really certain what direction my life was going to take. At that time, I had thought I was going to be a college professor like my dad and go into the world of academia. So I decided to go to United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities and get my Master of Arts in Justice and Peace Studies, which is essentially like a half ethics degree and half divinity degree. It was through that program where I sort of found a different and new relationship with Unitarian Universalism based more on activism and trying to make some good changes in the world, because I stumbled across MUUSJA. So I did an internship through United with MUUSJA, and at that time we were fighting the marriage amendment, which was going to make illegal same-sex marriage in Minnesota, and then we were fighting a voter ID amendment to the Constitution, which was going to disenfranchise lots of Black and brown and low-income people. And so that was sort of a new encounter of UUism when I started at MUUSJA, and then I sort of found things really exciting, like going to direct actions at the Capitol, feeling like it was fun to go out. I started meeting more in different kinds of UUs. So that was sort of the start of everything. Out of that activism, I was invited to join the Black Lives Minneapolis chapter in leadership because of that activism. And so all of a sudden I found myself really desperately trying to finish my thesis and then also do this really on the ground frontline work. I had also started working at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. So I would say that I more quickly than most people got to see a lot of different expressions of Unitarian Universalism, from MUUSJA to the Church of the Larger Fellowship to First Universalist congregation. And so at one point in my life, there was just a lot of UUism. I think that's still true today, but just in a different way. I would just say that my relationship now is one I feel very much a part of UU community here, even though I haven't been able to go to church for a while because I'm raising a small child and it's hard to get out of the house. But I definitely still feel connected. Sometimes in UU circles, we can get pretty hypercritical of our communities, which, I don't think is a bad thing, but I also like to talk about the good things. And I think something you can be really good at is staying in community with people and making sure people feel loved. And for people like me, my parents are both dead now, and I don't have a lot of bio family around. When my baby was born, it was actually a lot of UUs. Some I knew really well, some I didn't know that much, that were bringing me meals and making sure I was okay. So that piece of community just really makes a huge difference. And I think also co-founding and then starting Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, although we're national, it did help me just sort of understand that there are a lot of UUs exploring what it means to be trying to make changes in the world from a spiritually based mindset, and how to do that and stay fortified, and how to do that and stay connected and stay whole and not lose hope, and to get discouraged but then to find your way through it. So I would just say that I feel like UUism has definitely helped me feel more connected, imagine more possibilities, and to be in the questions with other people, which helps you feel not alone.
And it sounds like maybe finding your way into Unitarian Universalism all those years ago was also part of what got you engaged in social justice.
I think it's safe to say that, I would say my family of origin, my dad mostly, really prepared my mind to be thinking about race, class, and gender in particular from a structural systemic analysis. He taught race, class, and gender studies at the University of Minnesota for 20 years.
Some of that rubbed off on you, maybe?
Yeah, some of that rubbed off. Yeah, my first discussion about race was when I was 3, actually, and I was grappling with what it meant to be mixed race identity, right? Because both my grandpas are Black and Native, and both my grandmas are white. So I don't have a white parent like a lot of mixed folks, but, my dad was sort of telling me like, well, you're Black. And I was like, well, no, my skin is brown though. And he always likes to joke that was our first discussion about it. Culturally, yeah, I can't be anything but Black because not all of our non-Black sides of the family largely disowned us for being Black. And so I just grew up in a very middle-class Black family where, how you beat racism was really through respectability politics, right? Like become the college professor or whatever respectable job that is, a lawyer, an engineer, whatever, and really combat racism. I call my mom an intentional class climber, and some of that came out of their trauma of living in poverty as a young kid. That was the background I came out of. So it was definitely like a more individualized approach. However, I would say that my dad also did introduce me to a sense or understanding of God in community and then in nature. And I think all of that groundwork of understanding like how structural racism is and class inequality is really helped me early on. But I think my parents raising a family and stuff, they were not activists in that way. And they did other things, like my mom was one of the co-founders and helped serve on the Gibbons collection for African American literature at the University of Minnesota. And so they did a lot of other things like that. And then, of course, my dad was a teacher for so long. People still come up to me and say, like, oh, your dad really changed my life and really helped me as a teacher. That laid a good foundation. And so then when I found UUism and MUUSJA, I found a whole set of people that were like, yeah, activism, trying to reach elected officials. One thing I would say my parents didn't really educate me on, or maybe they just didn't have this deep of analysis, was just about power. They stressed a lot of your individual responsibility to take charge of your own life and work really hard. A little bit of like this buy into the American dream, like if you work really hard and save a lot of money, you can live a good life. I think through encountering the folks I did early on at MUUSJA, these are folks like Ralph Wyman, some other people at other congregations, Jane Bacon, who I just saw, she was out at White Bear. Like these are older people, right? But they are people that helped me sort of understand that the systems, like the political systems, the idea is that we can change them because we made them. And then that you have to have some level of organizing and being like connected goal with organizing a group of people. And I think, yeah, that it was definitely through that I started saying like, oh, okay, we can try to have conversations with lots of people about why same-sex marriage isn't scary and we shouldn't ban it and, stuff like that. And then connecting with a lot of Black activists who are not UU, right, in the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives, then I became much more intimately connected with a history of Black radicals and Black radical thought and Black revolutionary thought, right along with what I will call like respectability politics. I think it's definitely safe to say that that was certainly my segue into a much broader, wider world of resistance and imagining of a world that's based around meeting the needs of people, of all people, rather than just like serving profit and corporation.
What a beautiful vision that is too, right? To go from a perspective that maybe is a little bit more contained or a little bit more academic, and then stepping it into relationship and into community and just seeing the hope of how broad that network can stretch when you tap into it. So obviously you have this role as executive director of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, and that's going to be a really core part of how you show up for social justice. I'm just wondering if there are any other aspects in your personal life, perhaps, where you show up for social justice work in a different form.
That's an intriguing question. I'll recycle an answer that the amazing Meg Riley gave to me when I was working for CLF, which is there's a little bit of a false dichotomy that capitalism creates between private and personal life, in part because they want to exploit and help you not understand that whatever you're giving your life's work to is your personal time, it's your personal investment, it's your time away from caring from your family or investing more time in yourself or whatever that looks like for you. I think that message really carried through to me in some healthy ways and in some unhealthy ways. I will admit to being in labor with my daughter and answering work email. I will say that and that is it, right? Like raising a human is that what form that's taking now. And I am trying not just to raise a human. I want to raise her to be more integrated in herself, more fully loving of herself, and still aware of the inequalities that we face in the world. But I hope to do so in a way that's developmentally appropriate. I think my dad was sharing too much about the world with me too early, or in ways that felt really terrifying or more scary. And at times, that has definitely contributed to my sense of this is so overwhelming. We're never going to be able to fix all these things. So I think just trying to raise a kid who can see things sort of clearly as appropriate, but also still have a really solid sense of self and be learning right along with her. And so what that looks like right now to finding ways to talk about the genocide in Gaza that's happening and why we go to rallies to help the kids in Palestine and saying like all kids need our support and love and all people deserve to live and things like that. So trying to plant those seeds in developmentally appropriate ways. I'm not showing her pictures of war or anything like that, which is what my dad would have done, but I'm not doing that. So I'm just trying to plant those seeds early. So yeah, a lot of it honestly right now is around parenting. And I think one of the lessons from Blue too is that the deepest growth any of us do is in deep relationship with other humans where we feel seen and heard and where we also feel at least some level of safety, like we're not going to be judged. And so a lot of my work now has just transformed into trying to create and nourish those relationships both in Blue and outside of Blue, because I think that is where people can find the strength and the energy to keep working on whatever they're working on. The other stuff, it's been a hard journey. I've had to let go of some of the more outward facing things that I used to do all the time, right? Like marches, direct actions, going to the Capitol, having meetings with elected officials and presenting policy solutions. That's because running a household, being a solo mom by choice, I am done at 7:15. My kid goes to sleep, and by 8, it's like I can't leave the house. I can't go to a meeting. I also don't have the mental energy or capacity to sign on to a Zoom meeting because I've got dishes to do. I've got a lunch to pack for the morning, all these things. I've been leaning more into Buddhism. I found my way to Lama Rod Owens, who's this amazing, queer Black, a human from the South who has been studying Buddhism for 20 years. And he wrote this book, Love and Rage, The Path to Liberation Through Anger. And he wrote it for activists in a US context, right? A largely Black activist. And it just resonated so deeply with me. Obviously, this is not my first time encountering Buddhism, but in the past, the versions or flavors I encountered really vilified anger. They had treated it as this sort of toxic thing or pathologized it that you need to not express, that you need to move away from. And that always just didn't sit well with me because I have a lot of anger because of the way that the world treats people unfairly, largely based along lines of race, class, and gender. So I was like, this can't be wrong. Like this fundamental core emotion that I feel often and frequently, it can't just be like this evil, villainous thing that I need to try to erase or whatever. So other forms of Buddhism didn't resonate with me that advocated that. But then I found Lama Rod, and he was like, no, your anger is a gift and it's its own thing, right? And he said, and the beautiful part of anger is that it gives you energy. And oftentimes, if you are going through a deep depression or just any sort of inertia, like it actually is the energy of anger that moves you out of that. Or for me, like it has moved me out of hopelessness and despair and into action, into direct action, where then you can have access to other emotions. And so he said, we want to be understanding that that is a beautiful thing about anger. There's also a downside to it, right? Like it can be misused, it can be misdirected, it can compel you to react instead of having the space to choose a response. And I think that's been my big takeaway from his book, is that liberation can just be as simple as moments where anger would compel you to do something or react. It can just be having the spaciousness to choose your own response and to tend to the hurt that the anger is pointing you back to. There's like this common saying, it's been attributed to multiple people, but it's like, anger is just grief underneath, or anger is just hurt underneath. And the thing I like about Lama Rod's teaching, he's not like diminishing or erasing anger or like saying it's just this, but he's saying no, anger is its own thing. It has good uses, and just like anything, it has undersides to it, and it often is pointing us back to also additional hurt or pain that has been untended to or unprocessed. And so his thing is to, in order to transform your relationship with and to anger, you do have to go back and do the work of tending to the hurt, and then you can have a better relationship with anger and help it be channeled, that it's meant to help you move, and it's meant to give you energy, and it's meant to protect, and those are all good things. And so I just love that message. In my personal life now, a lot of my work has been about reforming and transforming my relationship to anger. And that's what I've been working on. And I found my way to the Common Ground Meditation Center in Minneapolis, which actually comes out of the Plum Village, tradition. So in my personal life, that certainly is what's happening for me. I want to say this without minimizing the awesomeness of youthfulness. I think my hubris in my younger years was like, yeah, we can totally change this, and of course we can. And then as I'm aging, I'm middle aged now. I don't want to say that I've lost hope to change it, because I haven't, but I definitely just see more, and I want to just support the young people who have that hubris and who have that energy, because that is what we need to change things. And so, yeah, personally, I'm trying to find ways to just contribute to other people who are out on the front lines and just support them and saying like, yeah, you can do this. And, I might not be able to show up at a rally or at these meetings, but I want to be a support and resource for you. But, I do have to be home at 5:36 every night.
I love that you're kind of drawing out how there's these various qualities that show up in justice work. When we're confronted with the injustice of the world, it stirs up a lot of feelings. When we're connected to our humanity and we're connected to the humanity of others, and we see people being treated poorly, it brings up these feelings that culturally in society, we are kind of taught are bad feelings that we shouldn't be feeling, right? But it sounds like part of your work has been learning to embrace these as spiritual allies, learning to kind of harness anger or harness the youthful hubris, or kind of tap into these various emotions that some people shy away from, and learn to channel them for good, learn to kind of help them feed the justice work instead of get in the way of it. So you've spent quite a bit of your life dedicated to various causes and activism, bridging all of these larger societal issues with race and class and gender in your personal life, your public life. How would your life be impacted if you stopped doing justice work the way that you're doing it right now?
I mean, I'm laughing because I'm just like, I can't imagine doing anything else. I think, because even before I was like doing justice work, professionally and in all these different spheres, where I was driving everyone super like wild because I would be talking about it, right? Like in my rugby team, and I would be just going on and on about something or some new law or some injustice that was happening in the world. And my teammates would be like, we don't care. Why are you still talking about this? We don't want to talk about this anymore. Like shut up. Or I remember like multiple different classes where I was the only student speaking up about a racial incident or something, and I could not let it go. I couldn't just let it go. And there were times where I was sort of like debating like 29 other students. There's something super isolating and lonely and terrifying about that. And I certainly felt all of that. And I ended up going to the University of Minnesota and graduating from there. But before my dad got sick, I would like go to his office, and his their department secretary would let me into his office, and I would just lay on the floor and just cry until he came back and could like give me a hug and be like, it's okay, it's really hard, but you are doing the right thing, speaking up and out about these issues. And so I think I did sort of find my way to, like, destiny feels like too powerful of a world, of a word. But, I definitely think I found my way to my purpose. And in part, I think that because oftentimes in those situations, people come back and they tell me how, like, years down the road, sometimes, they realize like I was right. And even if I, sort of did it poorly or my execution was off, or I was too harsh, they were like, I understand now the core of what you were trying to say, and I'm grateful that you said it. And that has happened enough times for me to know, even though whatever I was doing, whether I was waitressing or taking care of kids, it was sort of this thorough line that I was always going on these rants. So I just think that I found my way to my purpose. I'm so grateful that I did. I cannot imagine what I would be doing if I wasn't doing this. There are times where this work really gets you down. And I think in no matter what job you have, you sort of imaginarily, you're like flirting with these other alternative realities where you picked a different path and you're doing something else. And so this is one thing I do think I should have listened to my mother about. She had long time said, like, you should be a lawyer. You'd be a really good attorney. And, now that I pay attorneys and I see how much they get, like their hourly charge, I'm like, yeah, Mom was right. I should have been an attorney. But I also know that, like, the discipline and like the life hours that takes, I also know that wouldn't be compatible with my more open and like buoyant spirit. So I really can't imagine what my life would be like. And there have been times where I've wanted to quit, like, quite honest. And then I try to imagine, yeah, like what else would I do? And I'm sure like there might be something, but I guess I just have no idea what that is. I do think becoming a parent really helped me feel like I was also finding a powerful purpose, and it's helped me have more compassion. Honestly, I think before I was a parent, I would get really upset that people I knew or my friends, like, they weren't engaging sort of with the marches or the direct actions. They would be telling me like, yes, I agree with you on these things, then they wouldn't show up to anything. And it used to really, really get me really upset. But now that I'm a parent, I understand like more that's the sort of deep exhaustion that comes from the early years of parenting, and you just don't have the energy. And so it's helped me become a more compassionate person, more accepting person, and trying to meet people more where they're at and say like, yeah, maybe for this time in your life, this season in your life, if all you can do is write an email to your senator or whoever, like that can be enough, because it has to be, because you're raising these kids under capitalism, and it is hard. It is really hard. Like, I'm not some super big celebrity by any stretch of the imagination, and it's not uncommon for me to be out grocery shopping or somewhere and somebody comes up to me and says, Lena, I saw you speak at First Universalist 3 years ago, and you really helped me and you really changed my perspective on something. And so I think when I'm getting that feedback, I feel like, yes, okay, this is the right path to keep walking. Yeah. And I don't know what else I would do.
You touched just very briefly about how there can be like some pretty deep struggles with this work. And I know that one of the deterrents to staying engaged over the long haul is just how much heartbreak is involved in becoming aware of not just the issues themselves, but once we get into those personal stories and just hearing story after story about how people are impacted by all of the injustice that we want to help heal. So, could you maybe tell me about a time or tell me a story about a time when you really struggled with that heartbreak and how you deal with this tragic gap, as they call it, between where we are and where
Sure,
we
yeah.
dream?
I think there's a couple of things. One is that coming out of the Black culture and family that I did, this might sound weird, but there was never any delusions that the world was fair or just or right. I have no memories of ever believing that that was the way the world was. And I've walked this journey with a number of people, all of them white. My experience has been that, particularly with my friends and people who happen to be white, there was like an expectation that the world was fair. Something happens along the way, and then they see the depths of the lies that they were told, like in history class, right? And there's not just a sense of unjustness or unfairness, but there's also a sense of deep betrayal. And this also happens to Black and brown folks as well, right? Because we're all indoctrinated into the same system. I think my family did a really good job of saying from an early age, like, yeah, Thanksgiving, that is not the story we believe, right? Because we come from the Oneidas who were marched from upstate New York out to Wisconsin. And so we were just told the other sides of the story from a very early age. So I never really experienced that sense of betrayal in that sense, or like this deep thing. I think for me, there's been a couple of things. Is one, there has been that sense around economic systems and how deeply rigged they are, because I think my family, like I said, they did sort of believe this American dream, like if you can just sort of make yourself respectable enough and have a high enough economic class, you can in some ways beat racism. And some of that is true. And what I mean by beat racism is you can have more self determination and more agency over your own life. And some of that is true, but it's rigged, right? That was one thing that I really struggled with, is really seeing that, like, oh, these economic systems really are meant to benefit corporations and destroy the world. I think where I found the strength and courage to go on is from my Black traditions, right? Like my dad really helped educate me, and my mom too, just around, you have to believe that even if it's not something you see in your lifetime, you need to believe that it's possible to get free, right? And I'm just so grateful to my ancestors who thought that and who fought for that, because they got us to where we are. So oftentimes I'm able to just look back on my mostly Black ancestral roots, because that's where I'm most deeply rooted, and understand we have done more with less. And it all starts with dreaming and imagining and having the courage to imagine that it is possible and you do have some agency. We maybe don't have perhaps as much as we want, but we do have something. And when we come together, we can make it even more powerful. And then I think once you start doing that, especially for me, it was like direct actions, right? When you're out there and then you sort of feel that power. And you also, and this is might sound really weird, but you also feel the fear of like the state agents, and whether that's the law enforcement or official. I would often say, like, what are you afraid of from us? Like, what are you afraid of? Because we aren't the ones out here taking human lives, right? We are the ones asking you to change the laws and to change things so that we're saving human lives. Once I got a taste of that power, like, I loved it. And I was like, yes, I want more of this. And I think that's something we're also taught, to like be afraid of power, or to even think that power is inherently evil or inherently bad. And that was one of the most beautiful things out of, getting connected with a broader movement. I went to a training, it's called week-long training. One of the things I was able to walk away with from that training was that power is not inherently good or inherently bad, right? It's how people use it. And you can build power with people, or you can try to wield it over them. It is inherently neutral, right? It's power. And this is also where it becomes really important, right? Once I started to see that the same structures of oppression that are outside of us are also built up inside of us, that's where I really started to see, like, oh, a lot of my despair is coming from a sense of feeling like I don't have power. And who is telling me that? And what does it serve to believe that? And how do I start to, in the true UU tradition, like get really curious and try to experiment with that and say, like, where do we have power? What happens if we show up in protest and shut down a highway? What does that mean? And sort of experimentations in power and confronting power, right? And I think that coming into realization about power and trying to explore it really helped me assuage that despair that you can get trapped in sometimes, because there is this gulf, right, between the way the world is and the way it ought to be. But I think for me, it was more about not necessarily bridging that gap, really trying to believe that the way it ought to be is like we can reach for it, right? It was really coming out of that, like, it's possible. And so I think that learning about power, exploring power, and then going deeper and understanding that we're really taught too in our society and culture to respect a very patriarchal power over people as like really powerful. And you see that in some of our movement spaces around how people talk about their victories, around the particular tool of polarization, and how people will vilify their opponents. And for me, one of the things that I love about UUism is there's a constant calling back to not vilify our enemies in that way. But I do think it's like we have to be clear about the intentions and the goals and the will of people who want to continue these systems of inequality, right? So I think that's one of the challenges. How do you still hold, that other person's worth and dignity when they are participating in a horribly violent system, right? Like, and I don't have any answer. I just know that even to ask that question, I think gets us closer. And I just have seen how it has in my own work. So I think that's part of the answer, is just to even be able to ask that question, right? I think we see some of that, which I think is beautiful in Gen Z, and how the ways that they are resisting, they are not unclear about like genocide is wrong. And we don't care how you try to justify it or lie to us, it is wrong. And the tactics they're doing right now, on college campuses all across the country, right? Like they're dancing dabka, they're trying to do teach-ins, they're trying to really disrupt people's narrative. And then you see these stories where they're like, well, the protest turns violent, but the only people perpetuating the violence is like these cops. And then a protester might be resisting like the violence against their body, and then they're like trying to tell you that that's violence. And so I mean, that's a long rambly way of saying that I think power for me, and understanding and getting clear about the power dynamics, helps me bridge that gap a lot of times out of despair, because it comes back to, do I have power to affect change even in my own life, and then somehow reverberate that out, or also taking action outside. The other thing for me too is that my deepest points of despair have never really been about that gap, again because I came from this expectation that the world was never a fair place, but it did come from a sense of betrayal from other people, other activists, other organizers. I think I often sort of uncritically accepted people's presence without asking questions of like, why are you in this? What is your vision for a liberated world or our collective liberation? I wanted to believe that everybody who was, in the Black Lives Matter movement with me, or even in other like movements, were there because they believed in collective liberation, they believed in equality and things like that. And not to say that they necessarily didn't, but what I came to understand was that there were other priorities for them. Sometimes that was about making sure their own reputation or their own clout got raised. Some people had running for political office aspirations, and so they were really just doing it for that. And then there are also conflicts where people would be completely unwilling to extend grace to people for the ways that Empire was showing up in their work. And instead of like wanting to work through them with that, they would just exclude people and say like, you're out. And I saw this a lot along lines of like sexism and men coming into spaces and being really sexist and doing really messed up things, But instead of trying to take the time and talk with them through it or work through it with them, they were just kicked out and excluded. And I'm not saying like I would even know how to like work through some of that with people, but I also know and believe that like the answer wasn't just to kick everyone out. So a lot of my despair was like, holy buckets, like on sort of on the progressive side of things, even you could say liberal or like even more progressive, like whatever that is left of liberal, we talk about radical love, we talk about radical acceptance, we talk about these things, but we can't be in conflict with each other in healthy ways and come to resolution and come out stronger on the other side. And so for me, I was like, well, if we can't even do that, then what hope do we have of creating this world that we want when we can't even do that with each other? I've certainly been on the receiving end of it, right? Like areas where I have been in colleague with white supremacist thinking or ideas or strategy or tactics, and instead of people trying to work through that with me or to say, it was just like, nope, you're out. Okay, well, where do we go from here?
And how do we learn, and how do we build, and how do we grow that relationship and build trust if at the first sign of
Yes.
conflict you're out?
And that I think that's one of the greatest challenges of our time and our organizing, because I think it is really beautiful that people are willing now more than they ever have been before to give voice to when things are harmful. And on the other side of that, I'm like, how do we allow people grace and offer ways through that? Because in the end, like we will all do that at some point or time on an area of privilege, or just because we're human, like we will do it. And we've seen the results of that in our organizing in the Twin Cities, and we've seen it across the country with different groups. And about, I think it was 2017, I read MLK's Where Do We Go From Here? From Chaos to Community. And I both found it heartening and just darkly sad that a lot of the same issues that he identified then that they were dealing with in the late 60s, we were still dealing with them in our movement space. Like the exact same issues, like constant arguments over nonviolence or violence as a tactic, just like same issues around women and men leaders, just like, and I like the exact same issues. And I was like, well, that doesn't give me very much hope. Like, same place, like 60 years later, or 50 years later. But, here we are. And it did give me more grace for myself and my comrades to know that, like, this is just a very human struggle. And it's also reflective of what happens when you take away people's elders. Like quite literally, many of them are incarcerated or killed. And what happens to a movement when you do that, and what lessons are lost. So I really just think that that is one of the critical things for our movement. And in particular in UU spaces, I feel like some people are more open to conflict than others, but I also have seen a lot of white UUs, and I don't know the exact right terminology for this, but they're sort of more wedded to their hurt and harm, or more committed to it than to resolving it and letting it go. And I think there are certainly times in my life where I've been more committed to my anger than I have been to resolving it. And I think in part, that sort of speaks to a lot of us not feeling heard and seen in our lives. And so we just really want people to see us and hear us, particularly in moments of deep hurt or discomfort. And so one of the things I really think about in UU spaces is, how do we really let down our commitment to our hurt and try to commit more to, like, how do you know it's enough that somebody's hurt you and you can move on to a solution, right? And I've been in countless conversations where people have been made uncomfortable or even hurt by something I said or the way I said it. And I have tried to come back and say, obviously, I'm not here to try to hurt you. I'm here to try to help you see the injustice in the world. Can you meet me in the middle? And some people really are, and they really accept that. And they're like, yes, and they can move past it. And some people cannot. And that is also a place of deep, like, sadness for me, because I'm like, if we can't do that in our churches and our UU communities, how are we going to go out into the world and tell people like we're these loving spiritual people when we can't do that with each other?
And I think that ties into the Buddhism that you were mentioning before, that has become such a powerful spiritual path for you in recent years. There's a lot in Buddhism about being in the present moment, right? And when we are attached to a hurt from something that happened already, it's over. It's past. That happened. It literally doesn't exist anymore in the present moment, except for our attachment to it. And if we're so attached to that hurt from the past, it makes it really hard to either be in the present or build a future that we can look forward to together.
Well, and I think this is where also like work I've done with a trauma therapist comes in super helpful, because oftentimes it's not solely the attachment to the past, though that is definitely there, but sometimes it's also like there's an older version of yourself, like your younger self, that was so harmed in a similar way that, you know, what they really want is for you in your own spirit, in your own body, and the own constellations of being inside of you. They really want to know that they are safe and that they are heard. And until you can find the tools and the ways to give them that, it's almost impossible to put that attachment down, because it really is just this deep call to be heard, to be seen, and to be cared for and tended to in that hurt. This is also one of the things I love about Lama Radon, is that he really does, I think, a phenomenal job of integrating the trauma perspective into Buddhist teachings, which is something I really love, because there is other forms of it I've read. There's also this hyper focus on like your individual responsibility to like let go of these attachments. And this is where it comes back around to me to community, because none of us received these woundings in isolation. Isolation is its own kind of wounding, right? But none of us received these hurts and these wounds and this trauma in isolation. And so I really don't believe we can heal it in isolation. And there is a certain amount of it that is like, okay, how am I attached to this? How am I letting go of my attachment to this and embracing what is present, what is real now, which is that I'm not that small, powerless little kid anymore. I have agency, I have power. And again, when you feel like you have that power and self-determination and agency, and you feel heard and you feel seen, I think you are better able to be more present and to let go of those attachments. You know, trauma gets in the way, and all I can tell people on that is like, go get a really good trauma therapist, because they'll give you some tools and they'll help you. And it's a hard journey, but
but so worth it in the end for the healing that can come out on the other side, and the power that becomes accessible to you as
or
a
I would say
healed
always
person.
healing, right? Always healing.
So we've kind of been touching on this in the conversation, but I'm wondering if you might want to just say it a little more explicitly. Why do you think it's important for people to get involved with either social justice in general or the anti-racism, anti-oppression, multiculturalism type of work? What difference would it make to them as an individual to get involved?
Beautiful question. I love this question. I fundamentally believe that the lives we were born into, they're so mired in like capitalism, and like your purpose is to work until you die, right? Your purpose is to be a good, obedient citizen to these really destructive, horrific ideas in the world around how we relate to our natural world and around how we relate to each other. People don't have to scratch the surface far to feel this or understand this, right? Like, it's why there's such mass depression, mass anxiety, mass isolation, and loneliness in our world, is because people understand at some deep soul or spiritual level that your life was not meant to just be making money to survive. Like, that is a very vacuous surface level existence. Because I had these UU beliefs around our interconnectedness, our interdependence, and around dignity and worth, and around justice, that we were inherited this world. None of us necessarily asked to be born, right? But here we are. I think it's really how we come alive. And I mean that in a deep spiritual sense. How we come alive is connecting with each other, loving each other. And once you start to do that, if you're doing it in a real and authentic way, the injustices will become so blatant and so obvious and so clear, you can no longer turn away from them. That is true living. And again, like leaning into the Buddhism, it's like that's becoming fully present with all that is. And I actually did study a little bit of this in seminary when I was studying the Niebuhr School of Thought. And it's actually one that MLK studied a lot too, which is how do you ask even the right questions to give you the right response. And so in the world of ethics, every formal ethics boils down to a greater good argument or some set of virtues that change over time and based on culture. In our culture, being loud and extroverted is good leadership, but in other Eastern cultures, that is not good leadership. That's a variable and fault. And we see the atrocities that can happen when you're just looking at for the greater good to different minorities or individual. Niebuhr asked, how do we think about what is the fitting response? I was really moved by this in my master's level education. Like, yeah, what is the fitting response? Because we're not going to be obsessed with what's right or wrong because that changes and is variable. And we can't hyper focus on the greater good. You get like fascism and other things. But we can sort of ask, what's the fitting response? But in order to answer that, you have to know what's going on. And how you answer what's going on is going to inform and influence how you think about what the fitting response is. And so a great example of this is police brutality, public safety. And I saw this all the time in my work with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis. I still see it now. Let's just use like what's happening in Palestine. You ask a Palestinian or someone who's aligned with Palestinians what's happening, you're going to get that the Israeli government is committing genocide. They have displaced us from our homes. They are starving us. They are withholding water, shelter, and bombing us. Most people are going to say, wow, that's wrong. Now, if you ask that same question from an Israeli government perspective, they're going to say, we are defending ourselves against Hamas. This is not genocide. This is a response to a retaliation against us and to people being kidnapped. How do we sort of figure out what is the truth in that, right? What is the truth in that? Where do we find the truth in that? And this is where movement work comes in, is like, well, let's talk about power. And how do we figure out how to ask the right questions and how to understand and trust who's saying what? Let's talk about power, and not in some big theoretical sense. Who has the power to control people's food? Who has the power to control all of these things? Who has the resources? Power is often, and almost always connected to who has the most resources and access to it, money, military, all of that. And this is where, people have to really be willing to bring in some critical perspective and say, like, generally speaking, history shows us that whoever has the most power is usually not in the right. And they're usually not being 100% truthful in what they're telling you, because they also usually have some sort of self-interest, almost always motivated around money and more power, more resources. And so for me, that question about power, well, one, I found it a little bit lacking in the ethics of responsibility, but I also think that to bring it full circle about why I get involved with this stuff, right, is because the way of capitalist living is a powerless way of living, right? It's like the analogy in the Matrix, right? Like you're sort of living, you're alive, but you're in these these bubbles run by like machines and all these. And so for me, I'm like, look, do you want to wake up and get out of the Matrix? We can't like do that in real life, but you can reclaim some of your power, right? You can reclaim some of your power and become more alive when you start to fight with other people for more self-determination and more power. And I think like the thing I think a lot of people miss is that fighting with people who are most marginalized in our world only makes your life better. If you need a self-interested perspective to do it, right? Which I think most people do. It really, really does. And I think that is what most people fail to see, is sort of like, oh, why should I help like these Black people? Like this really isn't my problem. But it is, because then you get like a Justine Demond who gets killed by the police, right? And if people had been working with us at that time to institute some of the changes we'd been advocating for, or the accountability, maybe she'd still be alive. And so I think like really trying to help people see the interconnectedness of us all, right? And the interdependence of us all, I think is really powerful. The one caveat is one of my teachings from systemic theology from Paul Caput. He's like, look, what it gets down to is that you cannot make somebody else care about other people, though, if they just don't care. Right. I remember being really drawn in and struck with that argument that he presented to us. I was like, yeah, I think that's right. And that has been bared out in my work. Absolutely. After Trump was elected, I invited some neighbors over to try to talk about how do we fight against this? How are people feeling about this? And one neighbor straight up told me, like, he's a white guy with privilege, with financial resources and money. And he's like, I don't want to give up my privilege, period, point blank. He's like, so I'm really not interested. And he wasn't like a Trumper, like he thought this guy was whatever, but he's like, I'm not scared because I know I don't have anything to lose. And I know that I don't want to give up my privilege. And I was like, all right, kudos to you for being so upfront about that. And for me as an organizer, I was like, cool, I don't need to waste my time anymore reaching out to you. Fundamentally, I disagree with him. There's going to come a time in his life where like he's going to be affected by the fascist state that is growing and continues to grow. But I also was just like, yeah, Paul was right. I can't force you to care about other people fundamentally. So I think though that the vast majority of people seeing this, like MUUSJA folks, like UUs though, have already decided that they care about other people. And so for UUs, I would say that this is, again, it's about waking up from the matrix. It's about being more alive spiritually and more in the present and really digging to get to what is the truth of the situations we're in and why are we there. And I would say really cultivating a mistrust of power narratives. And I say that with the caveat that, like, I'm not telling you to go out and totally disbelieve, for instance, what the CDC is telling us about coronavirus or things like that. But I do think cultivating a healthy sense of mistrust, or maybe we could call it skepticism, is really profound in how we get to deeper change, deeper connection. And when it comes to anti-racism, any problem that you feel moved in the world to address, I promise you, any problem that you feel moved in the world to address is connected somehow in some way to capitalism built on racism. And a racialized capitalist system is what we live in. And so when we're thinking about it as connected threads, or sometimes we can think about it like a crumbling house, part of our job, I think, as other world makers is to be thinking about where are the weak links all around that are upholding these really terrible ideas. Some people would say, it's like racism, patriarchy, and capitalism, right? And they're all connected. And so if you start to pull out one, the ideas that will help the rest fall, and then in its place, what are we going to put, right? So that's the other thing that I think is fun to do, is to be like, well, what is the world we want to create? And start creating visions of that in art, in your writing, in your painting, in your knitting, in whatever you're doing, like create and start to think about the visions of it, because that's what will feed you in the dismantling of the really yucky stuff. But in the dismantling of the yucky stuff, there always has to be a racialized component in it, because that's what this country was built off of: genocide and enslavement. So if you really want to be really living into your UU values and really talk about interconnection, interdependence, building justice, the inherent worth of everyone, and honoring that and what that means, then I think you can't do it and hold on to your privilege at the same time. And that one of the gifts of the lessons of that neighbor, right? Like, you are going to have to give up some privileges, but I would say that what you're giving up, that pod in the matrix, but you're getting the present, you're getting reality with all of its flaws and all of its unfairness, but you're also going to find deeper love there, deeper connection. And that is what I think our souls really need to be alive and to live a good life, is just that deep connection, deep love. But you can't experience it if you're overly attached to your privilege, different privileges.
My goodness, Lena. I think that probably brings it all home right there. So any other question, I feel like, would kind of dilute that punch at the end right there. But there is something that I would love to just chat a little bit about. So much of your critical analysis of these issues and of your own commitment and participation to being involved in justice and making that such a core part of not just your life, but your community, your commitments. So much at the core of that is about power. And you come back over and over to talking about this critical power analysis. Also, mentioning, for example, the situation in Gaza, oftentimes the people with the most power are the ones abusing it and not using it wisely. But at the same time, getting involved in this work and kind of coming out of your matrix pod and emerging into reality and seeing things for what they are and how they're impacting everybody also gives you power. And having that power is something you want more of so that you can affect change. So I think, given that we span these two experiences of power, wanting more for ourselves to affect positive change, and also noticing the abuses of power that come with empire and large government, maybe it would be good to take a moment to define power.
So one, when you look at like sort of old school organizing, labor-based organizing, labor union organizing, they're going to talk about power as two things: people and money. If you can mobilize a lot of people, you're going to have power. If you can mobilize a lot of money, you're going to have power. And I do think that that is still true. You need to be able to mobilize people, to work with people together, to be able to go into the folks who have the power and to be able to put pressure on them, right, in our political system. That's a very important thing to acknowledge. So I mean a little bit of that. I also mean it's really about self-determination. And when I say self-determination, right, it's the idea that you can have the strength and the tools that you need to affect change in your own life. So perhaps like the ability to act, right? The ability to act in your own life in the ways that you want to is power. And obviously that is, living under capitalism for folks who are in wage labor positions. Time is a huge source of where people lose power, right? Time and energy, right? If you're working 2 or 3 jobs, you just really do not have the energy to be talking to your legislators, even educating yourself on the complexity of some of these issues that are deeply affecting your life, right? And so the ability to act and affect change, to me, that is power. And that holds true for both in your individual life and collectively. I think one of the best things I also did was I used to do work with the Center for Prophetic Imagination, and I encountered a minister there. He teaches a course on the difference between individual and systems, and how actually the vast majority of the options available to us are determined by the systems under which we live. So in order to really access more power, we need to be able to change the systems to give us more choices. And I think that when I talk about power, it sort of means both of those things. And then it means this third, probably invisible thing that I can most easily access: indirect action. And I will say increasingly too in parenthood, because it serves the forces of capitalism and consumerism to make you feel like a solution to all of your problems is to like buy something, even if it's to buy a course on self-improvement. It is not to understand that you are a human being, that just by being born, you have power inside of you. We are born helpless and we are born dependent on caregivers to care for us. And when you are born with caregivers who see and honor that power in you, and my parents did some of this really well, and some of it, I will be carrying around the wounds until I die, right? But there are ways in which we're taught any discontent, right, the solution is to buy it. But actually, I think the solution is within you, but you have to be able to tap into your own power to be able to give yourself the love you need. And that doesn't mean that we don't need other people around us to love us, because we need that. That is a core need that we have as humans. But it does mean that you have to be willing to remove those things and say, actually, like, you can't buy your way into loving yourself. What I'm actually saying is love is the power for ourselves and for each other, because that's where you find the firm ground. And that's where you find the way to say, I do have power over my food choices, even though the world doesn't make it easy and it makes it expensive to make better food choices. And this is I'm reflecting on my own current journey and struggle right now. I want to make that clear. It's like, actually, I do have this power in me. It talked about cultivating that healthy sense of mistrust. You have to cultivate this sense of internal power. And in lots of ways, it's stripped away from us as children, and we don't have a lot as children because we're so dependent on our families of origin, and then capitalism. So you have to be able to like strip away this misinformation about your own power to act in ways that you want to change. And once you start to cultivate those little itty bitty changes, then you will be able to see, wow, I actually do have quite a bit of power. And it's not the power over, right? It's not the power over people. And it's not this big sort of worldly power that the police wield over us, but it is a deep, loving power. And for me, I was only able to truly find my way into it through having my child, honestly. And some people, that's not true for them. So I don't want to like say like, I'm not saying like, oh, everybody has to have a kid to tap this. Nope, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying for me, like, that is the only way, because I had devalued myself so much. Even in this work, I had devalued myself for a variety of reasons. Again, these are all societal reasons that it served me to devalue myself and my power and my sense of self-love, so that I didn't act in the service of liberation, and so that I didn't act in the service of making it better for everyone who's marginalized. And once I had my child, I was like, oh, you, Lena, have to love yourself so much more deeply so you are not reproducing these harms on your kid, and so that you can love her better. That's the third sort of invisible piece that's much more difficult to talk about, because nobody really wants to hear love is power anymore, I think. Or people just are like, oh, yeah, that's woo woo, whatever. But, this is why, again, another reason I was so drawn to UUism, because, we have Side with Love, right? And I just think, when I was working as a co-organizer with Side with Love, we went on the Revive Love tour, and I did that with Caitlin Breedlove and Reverend Sekou. I think that's also where it's a different kind of power you feel in the room when you are like just creating beautiful moments with people around music and around connection, right? And again, those are the things we need. So when I talk about power, I'm talking about all of those things. We need money and we need people, but if you don't have love with that, you can get some really yucky movements for change, which we've seen and experienced. Simultaneously, if you don't have the idea that it's fundamentally about having better choices and being able to enact those choices in your individual life and in the world, then it's going to go awry. And Daniel Woolport from the Center for Prophetic Imagination, he's the one who really taught me. And a lot of what we have been taught is our individual responsibility is actually a systemic thing. That's also part of it. Being able to let go of shame. That's been another thing that I've had to recognize is a tool of the empire to keep us from understanding the depth of our own power. Because if you're so ashamed of who you are, if you're so ashamed of things that you were told were your individual responsibility and you're failing them, right? Like your weight, then it becomes a moral failing, when in reality, we can point to all of these other systems that are contributing to it, perhaps even more than your own individual choices. And that's not to say, again, that you don't have some level of individual responsibility, because you certainly do. But it's like we're definitely taught to overemphasize this and carry this deep shame when we fall short, when in reality, these are really huge systems that are serving a lot of capitalist racist structures. And that is something that comes up a lot when I used to do more like workshops in UU spaces, particularly with white UUs, is like this overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. And this is where I really like to point people to Brene Brown's work around guilt is actually a really good, beautiful thing. And it motivates us to not repeat harms against each other. And I want people to hold on to the guilt, because I do think it's healthy. I think it's guided me to different places in my own life. But what we have to start to see and let go of and see as a tool of empire is the shame. Because the shame is what shuts you down. The shame is what says, well, I'm just a white person and whatever I say is going to be wrong, and whatever I do is going to be wrong. And so I'm just not going to do anything because I don't want to be wrong, right? Like that's actually the voice of shame. It looks different in like people of color. We are taught to shame ourselves in other way. And As a Black woman, I am definitely taught to feel shame about my anger. It looks different for different people, but it's all the same wee beastie of shame. And it's a tool that Empire uses to keep us powerless, to keep us from enacting change in our own lives and in the world and communities around us. So I think the deeper we move into our own sense of power, at the core of that is love. The more we can disarm shame, the more we can disarm the idea that we are individually responsible for these mass systemic injustices, while at the same time being able to embrace our responsibility to contribute towards fixing these systems. Because in the end, they were made by people and they can be dismantled by people and we can build something else. So that's what I try to hold on to at the end of the day. Is these people who built these structures, they weren't smarter or more intelligent than us. They were perhaps more greedy and more clear about their self-interest. We need to be maybe more strategic, but there's no reason why we can't be more strategic, be more self-interested from an interdependent, interconnected theological viewpoint as Unitarian Universalists, and that gives me hope.
Lena, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us for our very first episode of Sparks of Justice. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show. You've been listening to Lena Gardner, Executive Director and Co-Founder of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. Thank you for listening to Sparks of Justice. This podcast is produced by the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance, or MUUSJA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting Unitarian Universalists to create a more just and loving world. Our first season of this podcast is made possible by a generous grant from First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. We are so grateful for their ongoing support of MUUSJA's mission. In addition to grants, MUUSJA is almost entirely funded by individual contributions from generous supporters like you. Your donations are tax-deductible and go directly towards staff and programs. It's easy to donate or become a sustaining donor. Please visit our website at www.muusja.org. Thank you for helping us build a more just, loving, and connected community in Minnesota and beyond. And remember to like, follow, and share to help us spread the word.